Okay. Hello, 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 and welcome to the show. Okay. Oh, yes. Nice. Nicey nice. Okay. Everything's got to be centered. Everything's got to be right. I'm kind of funny in here right now, so we'll see how my comfort level lasts. Hello, all, everyone. So glad to be here again for another new episode of Million Movie Project Presents. We've had a lot of busy episodes the last few, I guess, months, weeks. Last few weeks, I've been doing a lot of coverage of the labor movement going on over the summer and the WGA and SAG after strikes and things like that. There's not a whole lot of new movement on those things, so I kind of drew that to a close temporarily, and I will cycle back when there's a little more news to report. I don't really see this as like a news reporting type of a situation, but being that at least the Million Movie Project part of the whole thing is entertainment based. Oh, geez, sliding down. Is entertainment based. I like to talk about it a little bit because it kind of falls into, all the things that I tend to talk about here. So, and for the fact that the other show that I do here, meanwhile back at the ranch, that also is kind of entertainment based, and what I'm doing basically to entertain you. So it all falls in, but there's not a whole lot of information to report other than that the auto unions have now joined in striking for better working conditions. So there's not a lot to say about any of it really right now. So like I said, I'll cycle back when there's some headway that's been made or a little more going on. I do have a few episodes where I talk a little more in depth about that, and there is I guess it's about two back, episode 8 or something like that of Meanwhile Back at the Ranch. Maybe it is, I'm not sure. I don't know. If you check into my previous couple of episodes, they're titled, but I go into a pretty in-depth conversation about what I believe needs to happen, where unions move past just being tied to labor and start to just represent citizens who never had the opportunity to join unions, like renters, gig workers, disabled people, retired people, so on and so forth. I'm not going to get into that now because like I said, if you look back, if you want to hear about, all of that and why I think it's necessary, I give a pretty in-depth conversation about that, or meditation, I guess I should say. So it's not really a conversation, is it? But you can check that out on all my past episodes of whatever you're into. And we're now starting to get into the point of the year where I am getting close. So I guess we're all getting closer, finally, to the release of my book, Another New World, the one about Buster Keaton in the latter half of his life, or latter section of his life, like last couple of decades. And I've been talking about it the whole time, and I've been doing this, I guess, about a year now, but initially when I first decided I was going to set a date and release it, because it was just had gone on for so long, that in the movie together cumulatively have been 13 years worth of work, and I really needed to be able to be done with it, because when you get into the kind of the perfectionist mindset, and especially when you're doing like something historical or nonfiction, it's really easy to fall into the keep adding, keep working, keep molding, keep fixing, keep adjusting mindset. And that was something that I realized, like, okay, this has got to stop. I can't keep doing that. I'm not going to get every single moment of every single thing in here that I want to get in. I'm just going to have to draw a line and move on with my life, because generally when I'm writing and creating, I do fiction, and I feel really connected to the work, because if I made a mistake and then I write something different later, I'm like, oh wait, no, I like that better, we're going with that. I can do whatever I want. It's very, very much a playing God situation. If I go on a creative tangent, I can do that. But when you have something again true to life in nonfiction, you are really limited to how creative and how tangenty you can get. So I had to rein it in early in the process, but it's been going on for so long now, and it's there was a lot of negative things going on with the production initially, and which I talk about in previous episodes, but we're moving on here. It's just, it has not been the greatest experience that I've ever had creatively. I could say that. Very exhausting, very difficult. Worth it, of course, because that's really what it is. Anything that you struggle with, I feel like artistically, um, as long as you can pull something together in the end that you're happy with, then you basically did what you set out to do, regardless of the fact that you were miserable while you were doing it. So I'm glad that it's done. I'm still in that mode where I have the mini panics, thinking that I need to be doing something, like that if I'm not for like 2 seconds, because it got to. I'm really kind of coming out of a very serious burnout period that it took to get the things ready and for market, which they are now, as far as I can tell. I'm going to be ordering my author copy soon, which I'll be able to actually physically show you. And again, the physical copies, the paperback and hardback copies, will be available, made to order from Amazon on November 25th. But big news, the digital version, the ebook god damn it, ebook version is available for pre-order. You can pre-order it now, and on November 25th it will just show up on your device. You don't have to pre-order it now. It's anytime in between now or then, and I'm assuming if you order it on November 25th, it would also just automatically show up on your device. It's just something that Amazon does. They don't, for some reason, allow pre-ordering of the paperback and hardback editions, but do allow it for the ebook editions. So if you're super juiced and you were already planning on getting a digital version, you can pre-order it if you want to, just for, the fun of it. So that's available now. And it's exciting, I think, just to have, know that we're all getting closer to the release, because I'm super excited to be able to finally get it out. I'm super excited that it ended up, I talked about this in a previous episode, I think the previous episode, where due to printing costs, I discovered that I wasn't going to be able to include the photos that I had revised and sliding down again, jeez, that I had revised and brought back to life and added real life color to. And I'm not talking colorizer app on the internet. I'm talking about actual, like, colorizing real life color. And due to the fact that that was going to be, color, and there were so many already in that I intended to include, the printing cost was going to be way too high. So what I realized I had to do is I was going to split them in twine. And now the book that Another New World that is coming out November 25th is the text of the story, the text. And then so sometime after that, I'm not exactly sure when, I will be able to release just this, the second volume, which would be Another New World in pictures, essentially. And it will tell the story in photos. Some you probably have seen before. Some you definitely haven't seen before. But they've all been adjusted for clarity, and I've had to rebuild some things that didn't come through, that where the light completely washed something out, or there was some damage. One image I repaired had Scotch tape on it, so I had to write out the Scotch tape, essentially. So I'm also an artist and a graphic designer, so I painted the cover and designed it. So all these things I do myself, and if I had known that I was going to end up ultimately splitting them into two, I wouldn't have done all of the work that I did on the images that I did work on. But the good news about it, I think, is you can now buy the book, which is just a book, but if you like it, you can buy the version of it in pictures, like a tabletop book. And if you don't like it, you can still get the version in pictures. So it wasn't initially what I was planning, but it was sort of a lemonade out of lemon situation. So I'm happy with how that all came out. And I'm glad to be able to give you all more content, because I've talked about before, I do have more content Buster related in the pipeline, but also I have non-Buster related content in the pipeline. So I might be going to a non-Buster project I haven't really sorted it out, but I might be going on to a non-Buster project and then revisit it, the picture in pictures to get all that done. Um, so I don't exactly know the release order of how things are going to go yet. All I can tell you for sure is the text version of Another New World will be available November 25th. And the digital version is available for pre-order now. I'm also, next month-ish, I want to try to, or maybe beginning of November, probably actually closer to beginning of November. Next month's kind of a big month for like parties and get-togethers and fun having, so I don't want to really conflict with all that. But I will have I know I've been threatening you for a while with it, but I do have the finished playlist that inspired. It's not what there are mentions of songs in the book, but these are actually the songs that inspired me, whether it was the way that, a certain part of a song sounded, or the vibe of it, or sometimes lyrics, how they all kind of flowed together. And if you listen to it before, you may get some clues about where it's going. And if you listen to it after you've read it, you probably can make the connections a little bit more. But what I think is super fun about it is that it's sort of there's a few instances in the book that are maybe semi-interactive, where you could maybe watch or do something at the same time you read something, so that there's a little bit of surprises just in there. And this is, I think, one of those things, and it is printed in the book, by the way. So if you miss all my social media posts about it, there is a track listing in the back of the book that you can play at your leisure. But the cool thing I think about that is what inspired me, the songs that inspired me. I will tell you, it's 12 songs, and there were a lot more, but I really kind of had to cut things back. I couldn't go megalomania on it. And that was kind of the issue with the pictures as well. I really couldn't go that, put everything I wanted to, but now I can, having the second volume. But in regards to the soundtrack, that'll probably be out around early November, before the book comes out, to give you a chance to listen to it, see where my head was, see if you can kind of guess what's going on before you actually read the book. And the tracks also tell the story in one way or another. It's not necessarily only lyrics or only about Buster, by the way. But there's different elements to it, but the tracks, in the order that they play, do correspond directly to what happens in the book, in the order that it happens in. And when I release the social media posts, I have a pre-made YouTube list that plays in order, and I will release that as well. So a bit more fun coming your way before the actual release. And that's about all the news I've got for you right now, as that goes. This is going to be kind of a full discussion I wanted to get to. I know that when the lines tend to blur between the two shows that I do, not only because they look exactly the same, because I shoot in the same way, in the same light, in the same room, my area, and I shoot on a bed, which is fun for me. So I like to do that. It's more comfortable, and I like that. I don't know a lot of shows that shoot on a bed that are like legit, so I like to do it, except for the scooching down all the time. I'm always sliding out from under myself, but I have to have my comfort, and I feel like a desk chair is not comfortable. That works for some people, doesn't work for me. Probably also editing works for some people instead of just saying whatever comes off the top of my head. So I hope that you're looking forward to the book and the soundtrack and all the good fun stuff I've got in store for you, as much as I am. But I will leave that there for now. I think I've talked about that enough on an episode that I really wasn't intending to spend that much time on it, because I like to try to relegate it to Meanwhile Back at the Ranch episodes, and then try to stick to movie, TV, media stuff in the Million Movie Project Presents. And again, if you're just joining us, the Million Movie Project Presents is something I've been doing since 2008, and it is really just a spreadsheet of every movie that I've ever watched, including documentaries, and with the ultimate goal to get to 1 million, which I know is not going to happen, but I'm going to try. And I've just been doing it all these years, and it's now in its 4th generation, because it's, I create a new version of it every now and again for fear of it crashing because it gets so big. And that's why I devoted like a second episode situation, a second series to doing TV and movie reviews, because I'm so into that kind of thing. And and if you haven't seen any of my previous episodes, I talk movie history, I talk reviews, and I'm going to be doing a review show again coming up. I do them about every 3 months. But going a little bigger than that, this entire endeavor was intended to be a podcast recorded and edited devoted to the TV Western Bonanza, because that's my favorite thing and I know everything about it. People used to call me like I hate when people say this stupid shit, but it's true. Like, I had some friends that would tease me and call me Bonanzapedia because I knew so much about it. Like, I would just start relaying facts that nobody asked for, right? So the whole thing was meant. That's why the original episodes are called "Meanwhile Back at the Ranch" as a reference back to Bonanza, and then this spinoff of the Million Movie Project is now what I try to have some order to what I talk about. So I have done one Bonanza episode. I intended to do more by now, but things happen, so I haven't gotten the chance. But just to kind of explain my mindset on this is I'm going to try to tackle things topically when it comes to Bonanza, like things that, different aspects of the show, because it went on for 14 years. It was an institution in television, and they did things that other shows never did or couldn't do. So I really want to kind of, when I do Bonanza episodes, talk about, the different aspects of the show, whether it be fan canon, actual canon, my own thoughts about things, all those things kind of jumbled up. And when you talk about a show, a fictional show where continuity wasn't a super big issue, you do kind of end up in a jumble situation. So, that being said, this episode, I would like to spend some time, as I will do with all of the characters, but we know that the silent character of the show is the Ponderosa itself. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about the origin of it and what ultimately happens to it. And again, what's canon, what's not canon, what's fan canon, my thoughts, that kind of thing. So that's where we are for Meow. So, let's go. This is actually these conversations also are going to be pretty fluid when it does come to Bonanza, because some things I'll talk about really ultimately are another part of another conversation, which is another part. So sometimes I'll repeat what I'm saying in the context of one thing, but it'll also be in the context of another thing. So if you end up down the road watching just the Bonanza ones, like back to back, the conversation will be pretty fluid of what exactly is going on, about who and what. And I intended to, go through all kinds of lore, I guess, and what things are. So this one, I want to start out with basically the story of the Ponderosa and what we know, what we don't know, and that kind of thing. So when you watch a historical show or historical movie that you really love, or with something you connect to, but something that's not in the present, let's say, there's always a sense of futility with it, where you can choose. I mean, okay, I'm watching this in the present time. This was set in the 1859 to 1874, essentially, loosely. But again, there's a lot of continuity issues where we kind of have to make some mental leaps there and do a little gymnastics about what exactly and how exactly things connect. But they don't exactly make it easy on us. Back in that time, it was serialized, but also anthological. So it was a little bit of both, and that really kind of makes it confusing. And before the internet, when you could, or before really good ways of keeping track of what you were doing, or that it even mattered to the writers or the producers or whatever, they really relied on actual libraries. The studios had actual libraries and librarian type people that they would literally make a phone call to and be like, what happened in the Virginia City silver boom in 18 whatever, and then they would research it and they'd come back with a list of information. So it was a functional system, but it wasn't like today where you have it right at your fingertips and you could just come up with it really quickly. So the thought about that is, they did have to go to a little bit more trouble, and then they didn't always, the show that goes on for 14 years, they didn't always have right at their fingertips, oh no, this is how that went at this time. So what, and with a revolving pool of writers over the years, directors over the years, then things don't always line up. So that's where a lot of the fans who are historians about the show, a la me, come in and try to fill in the gaps historically and logically to the best of the ability. And then some things in the fan canon have became so popular that it almost has become actual canon. So without further explanation, I don't think that is needed. And I do have like a whole massive page of notes I'd like to get to. This is kind of what, with gaps filled, I think the Bonanza, or the Ponderosa story really is. With clearances for mistakes and errors that they make in the timeline of stuff. But again, when you watch these things, you watch with a sense of futility, because if I'm watching this in the present, and this is set so many thousands of years ago or hundreds of years ago or whatever you want, those people would be, if they were real, they would be all dead. So you can decide if you want to leave it where it is, or if you want to delve further into the history or the lore of it, and I'm going to do that. So if you are the type of person who doesn't want to think about what happens after the show ends, this might be pretty sad. But I think that if you look at, in particular, Ben's story, from what we do know about his past to what we ultimately find out, and I will have an episode on him, and I don't want to get too deep in it. I'm also going to have an episode on their genealogy and stuff like that. But like I said, the conversation floats. That actually Ben, his life is kind of complicated in the way that he had a pretty large segment, about 40 years of really good life. And then everything kind of before that, and then everything after that, not so much. Actually pretty bad. So, we don't have a clear explanation about how Ponderosa Ranch came to be, or exactly when Ben reached Nevada. But what we do know, the last time we see him in flashbacks is for the episode Journey Remembered, and that is when Inger, oh, by the way, spoilers, and we are actually kind of celebrating a Bonanza milestone. It's 46, no, 64. It's 64 years this month since the premiere of the show itself. So, and I'm glad people are still into it. That's the whole thing about that too. I'm still into it. I've been into it since I was a sophomore in high school, and that would be like 21, about 21 years myself. So, anyway, I'm old. But point being, it still has things for audiences. It's still enjoyable. It's still a good vibe. It's still interesting. Yeah, it's a little PI, but not so much as a lot of other things are. And it always intended not to be. It was a very forthcoming show. It was very cutting edge. They had to default to some traditional religious stuff some of the time, but they also always wanted to portray things like show you like anti-racist storylines, or anti-sexist storylines, or anti-animal cruelty, or destruction of the earth, like they wanted to show you, kind of open your eyes to certain things, and they did. I think they did a really good job for what they were allowed to do with it, in the medium they were allowed to do it. It was an NBC show. There was really not much more to it than to sell RCA color televisions, and it ultimately became an institution that we still celebrate today. So when we talk about the origin of the show, the last time we see, did I say major spoilers? Because there's going to be major spoilers on the 64-year-old show. So if you haven't made your way all the way through it, or at least most of the way through it, and you're worried about that, you probably want to tune out at this point. But the last time we see a flashback of Ben's physical journey west, which started in the east, is when we are seeing the second episode with Inger, which is called Journey Remembered, and Haas has just been born, and they ultimately are pinned down in a place called Ash Hollow, Nebraska, which is a real place, and they have a fight with a local tribe there, who want a guy that's in their wagon train, and they were historically correct on that. That was part of the Oregon Trail. They were on the Oregon Trail and they were headed for Oregon originally. So Inger is killed there, and then we leave. And then we know at some point beyond that they end up in Nevada and they stay in Nevada. Now, of course, you could theorize anything you want to. They went to Oregon, didn't like it, come back. They stopped in Nevada for any manner of reasons, and they liked it. But logically, I think it kind of falls along the lines of, because there is no clear explanation, that it was the next, one of the next main destinations. And at that point, I think Ben was pretty much tired of traveling, had a 6-year-old child and a newborn, and was tired of traveling with babies. It was very dangerous anyways, and now it's very dangerous for them. So I think he was more motivated to find a place to stop, that he was okay with, that he knew he had his mind set on Oregon, but that was still so far away from Nebraska that I think that in his mind he was just like, I have to do something for my kids. And we know that at this stage in his life he didn't have any money. Now Inger, I believe, she sold the store. She owned a store, but I don't think she left it in Gunner's hands. I'm pretty sure she sold it. But I can't remember if that's specifically addressed. Anyways, they together would have had a little bit of money. And it's not specifically discussed, but what we know is that he had to settle somewhere. And I think that he settles in Nevada, because I think what happens is, and again, this is not specifically addressed, he reaches this place in Virginia City, sort of just starting to rise up, because there has been from shanty town to actual city, because we're right around the time of the real historical silver boom that happened in that area. There was a silver strike, and what it seems to me is that he wanted to get off the train and wanted to get somewhere where he could just stay. And this felt good to him, and he felt like, well, this is probably as good as Oregon is, and I got to provide for my kids. So my thinking is that he took what money or assets he had, bought a small tract of land, very small, and land at that time would have been super cheap, because we're right at the beginning of the silver boom. Then, or maybe it hasn't quite happened yet, then he could come by it pretty easily. The money would go pretty far. And that's also says to the point that there could have been like a pre Ponderosa and pre barn situation, because that was usually what happened when pioneers went out to find a tract of land. They would usually build very quickly some sort of structure, just like a small cabin, a small barn for whatever they had, just to get by, with the mindset of making it better as they were able to put in more work, right? So that has not been specifically said, but probably there was. And usually what they would do is they would build, if it didn't burn down, which usually happened, because these things were put up really fast, and it was very easy for them to burn down. But if that had happened, then usually people would build onto the structure, and the house would get bigger and bigger and bigger. But if you think about the layout of the house, it really doesn't support that idea very much. So I think probably whatever happened, they had a small cabin or something to this degree, a small barn, and then probably leveled it. Because when there's silver strikes, you go from a little bit of money or no money to super rich immediately. Like, there's no in between, right? Like, there's no, like, we years and we toiled. Ben's toil was basically behind him when he got there. And I think he probably also found that it was like an interesting place to settle, seeing something come up out of the ground like the way that it was, and things happening, I think also appealed to him on that level. Like, okay, well, there's something here. It's not out in the middle of nowhere. There's something growing here. I can make this work. I can find work. I can do something. And we know that he wanted to be a rancher and was going out west to do so. That's the dream that he and Inger had, but he wasn't specifically like a miner or, anything like that, or a timber baron, which he became, or a livestock baron, which he became. These weren't exactly things he had, expertise in. So he kind of learned as things went along the way. And so he to be able to settle, he probably built a small house on a small plot, and then ultimately found silver on that land of his own, because we know from the map that actually the whole the whole of the Ponderosa is pretty much the entire, at least half the state of Nevada, if not more, when you see it on the burning map, right? It's a gigantic piece of land that he ultimately purchased, and it was in the west, so it was still being settled and that kind of a thing. So if he bought a little piece of land at the time of the silver boom, found silver on it, then ultimately like copper and some gold and topaz and things like this, that being the least of the of value, but point is the same. Then he immediately could turn that over into being able to expand his property lines and build the actual house of the Ponderosa. But we have a little bit of actual canonical discrepancy here, because we know that he more than likely didn't go past it and come back, but stopped there on the way, and didn't finish the trip to Oregon. And we know that Adam was about 6 years old when we last see him as a child, and that Haas was a baby. And we know that ultimately Joe was born there. So, and they're all, this is just a few years apart, respectively. So we have to basically assume that he stopped there on the way, was somehow a part of the Silver Strike, and ultimately was able to start selling off timber and acquiring livestock and acquiring land. So his early investments happened pretty quickly, but probably within the span of about 6 years. And I come up with that because there is a point where it is mentioned, which is almost kind of nonsensically, that early in the series, Ben makes a comment about, I can't remember exactly which episode, but Ben makes a comment about Adam helping design the Ponderosa layout, like how the house would go. But when he cites that would have happened, it would have made Adam 12 years old. And we can, if we want to, and I know Adam fans would do that, kind of paint him as a prodigy. And ultimately we know he spends some years at college and things like this, so that come up later. So before the show actually begins. But what if you want to go along with that, you can. I mean, if you're in a situation where anything goes, you got the money, you can build it, you want to let your 12-year-old kid who's helped you the entire way along, kind of help you design it, and he's kind of prodigious about that kind of thing, that works. Okay, if you want to go along with it, okay, I'm not totally against the idea. And it's not that complicated, I wouldn't say, to come up with a layout when you've got all the space and all the resources anyway. So I would say that if you want to follow along with that kind of narrative of what we know for sure that is mentioned, then that would have been about a period of about 6 years. If you don't like the idea of him designing it at 12, then you can pick up something else. But that is mentioned in the show. So, not that he was 12 when he did, but just that he did assist in the designing of the Ponderosa, and in the time that they say that it happened, and that's when the age he would have been. So, you could take it or leave it on that one. Doesn't bother me. I don't get too hung up on it. And we also know that there was a lot of conflict between the way Adam felt about Joe's mother, Marie. He was not... Oh, I guess that is the last flashback we see, but they're already settled by then, and we already knew that, so that doesn't affect anything. Anyways, that's the last traveling flashback we see is Inger. But there was conflict between Adam and Marie, and not between Haas and Marie, obviously, but there was conflict there, and essentially the conflict was, and I'll talk more about this in Adam's episode, but essentially the conflict was Ben goes to New Orleans to meet the widow of his foreman, to let her know that he has died, and he wanted to come there personally and say so, because as his employer felt responsible for doing so. And he goes on his little New Orleans adventure and meets her, and then they develop a relationship, and he would ultimately bring her back to the Ponderosa, and would not likely have written to them about it. Would have left Adam. We know that he left Adam behind in Haas. Obviously, they didn't travel, and Joe wasn't born yet. We know it was a solo adventure. So effectively, we're looking either way. If you want to think about it, he wrote to him and told him, or that he didn't, which I think he probably didn't. It's a little hard to explain in the letter that I'm coming home with a new wife. I think he probably just showed up with her, and in his zeal to have a new wife, right? So we get into this situation where Adam has been this entire time the right hand man, the tester kid, the kid who's been through literally everything by the side of his dad, treated like an adult every step of the way. Watched over Haas like it was his own child, because that's just how it is to be the eldest child in a family, and especially if you add in this pioneering stuff and this rugged living. And then suddenly your dad, who was supposed to be your partner and all of this stuff, shows up with a new wife, and she's the new partner. So this did not go very well in Adam's mind. He felt very put out. He felt very betrayed. And ultimately was old enough to go and leave for college. And him going to college is a very big point of his story. It's mentioned a lot of times. He went to college in the East somewhere. And it may have been shortly thereafter of her arrival. I don't think that he stayed there for very much longer. So he could have been a little bit young to go, but I don't think Ben would have gotten in his way to go. And what I'm saying is I don't think that they were like, okay, you are 18, you can go. I think if he was 15 or 17, they would have been like, yeah, it's cool, go. You're making a lot of problems for us right now, and we're trying to have a life together. So he's feeling left out. Ben's kind of rocking a hard place, but he's obviously going to side with his wife. So there is some literal betrayal there between the two of them. So I think the relations were very difficult for a few years, and Adam ultimately comes back several years after she died, because I think he kind of felt like, I can go home again, that kind of a situation. And so then they really start functioning as a unit. And at that point, when the show starts, which would have been approximately 1859 to correspond with the 1959 actual date, then they had probably held on to that for about, according to the math that I gave earlier, probably would have held that land for about 23 years. And the Ponderosa itself would have been about 17 years old as we see it. And in the beginning, as we see it, it doesn't really change all that much through the next 14 years. So altogether, that's about 37 years to the point of the close of the show. Okay, and then we'll get, into that point in a minute. But we're talking about getting there, building it, living there through what we see, and then the end of the show, that's about 37 years of time. And what ultimately, it's kind of the house, there's always been this talk about the layout of the house is strange because the barn looks like it's in the front. And yes, we have a Bonanza fan watching. Yes, Bonanza is great. That's why I'm talking about it. The layout is a little bit unusual compared to what you would normally see maybe in other shows, but the layout's really not that unusual compared to what you would see historically. And they did have a mind for historical correctness and historical storylines, even though they weren't always there. But they'd have historical characters come through, which I'll talk about in more detail another time. A list. They'd have historical events that they were part of. But with the concept of the barn standing up front, that really wasn't unusual in terms of homesteading, because the barn would have been the structure that would have been built first. You obviously you need a place to sleep, but you got to have a place to keep your animals, to keep them safe and from dying and away from predators and out of the sun and this, that, and the other. So it was very common to build a place for the animals to go first and then work on wherever you were going to live. So even if you think about the original layout, maybe it would have probably been about the same, and they just knocked those buildings down and built more grand buildings in their places, which is probably what would logically happen. So that's why, if anybody was ever wondering why the barn is out front, also it allowed them to keep an eye on it better. It was right within earshot. They were always working in the barn. 24/7, somebody's going out to the barn for something. And the barn is juxtaposed in such a way that it sits in front of the house in full view of you can run to the door, the windows, you can see it, you can hear anything going on with it, because you got to imagine everything is dead silent there all the time. And if you're looking at it from the front view of the house, there are two ways into the property, and one is the main road, and that leads to Virginia City, which is also again about a 2 hour ride by horse. So that was usually like that's sort of the business way or the stranger way, right? Let's like if people come out of the city out to the Ponderosa, they're going to take the road, and that comes in around the barn, and puts anybody new or different or maybe unwelcome almost sort of trapped in that space between the barn, the house, and bunkhouse. But there's also to the right, again, looking forward at the building, which is the meadow entrance. And that's more for the local people around the area or people working in the area, whatever, who know them a little better and will come up to the house that way. So there is, you don't realize it because sometimes they don't go off to the right. They usually take the road entrance. But there are two ways in and two ways out. And the layout of the house, initially, the bunkhouse was connected to the house, and there was a doorway that led between the two. And the original house might have been the bunkhouse that they, built the actual other house on, if you want. But there was a doorway just in front of the stairway, and sort of between the stairway and Ben's office space that connected to the bunk room or the bunkhouse where the workers worked. And later that connection's gone, and it's a separate building. And I don't know if that was intentionally they did it or there's just sort of upgrades to the set, whatever. But that stopped being connected there, and that was sort of posed to kind of a danger to them anyways. You don't really want strangers that you just hired out of whatever to sleep next to you with just a door they can come in and out between. So that sort of became more of a logistical safety measure to separate the two. And that also points out that there's always people around. Sometimes we don't see them because they're meant to be off working or whatever, but there's always people around, or should be. And we do see that to some degree. But the layout of the actual house, the way that it was filmed was also, the whole of Bonanza was a revolution in the way that it was filmed and processed and presented, because it was a cinematic quality television show which did not exist up to that point. And we're talking scores, we're talking color, we're talking cinematography, we're talking stunts, we're talking genuinely good acting, good casting. We're talking all of these factors that would get put into a big budget studio movie into a television show. So they realized that at the time of setting all of these sort of things up, that they weren't going to just be able to have a cutaway set, like an I Love Lucy type of a situation. Like that really wasn't going to work for something that they were trying to give you the idea that it was a 360-degree dimensional world. And so what they ultimately did, which again was a first in television, is there were little panels in the walls. You don't see them on film. They never actually filmed them, but so that they could film everywhere, or they could transverse the area of the bottom floor of the Ponderosa, which when you walk through the front door, there is the dining room, there is the fireplace, there is the main living space, there is the staircase, and then there is Ben's office area. An open floor plan, basically a very kind of basic space, really. Now we know the kitchen is further off past the dining table, which in the set wasn't actually there. And we know there's an upstairs, which again in the set wasn't actually there. The actual set just consisted of that bottom floor. But there were panels on the walls that could slide open and closed, where they would put the cameras through and shoot through these hidden panels on the wall, so that they could shoot 360 degrees of the set. And cameras could be on at the same time in different places. If they just came into the film, they just wouldn't use that piece of film. So it was a revolution in filming in that way, that they did make it so that they could take full advantage of this set in a full type of way. And we also know that when you come in through the front door, this is kind of a little bit of a evolution, let's say. When you come in through the front door, there's a little half wall right there, and right on the other side of the half wall is a door. And what that is another bedroom. And there's a doorway leading outside. So it's a private bedroom. And initially, we see that seems to belong to Hop Sing. And as time goes on, he actually doesn't live, or he doesn't use that room anymore. That's sort of very in the beginning, and then they kind of get away from that whole idea. So that goes to say that he would have had his own living quarters, probably on the back side of the house, because we never see the back side of the house. We see maybe a little bit off to the side, but only the front, basically, and then in the meadow sometimes. But we never see the back of the house. As far as I know, I don't remember. I don't recall any point when we actually see the back of the house. Because actually it wouldn't have existed in terms of the actual set. So we have to assume back there are a few things. Let's say a cabin space, a reasonable, decent. And Hop Sing was one of the family. They're not gonna just be like, go out and live in the shack next to the outhouse, right? So they're gonna give him something decent, his own quarters, which makes sense. There's no real reason for him to have to live in the house with them in a room, right? He should have his own quarters. So he's gonna have his own quarters back there. There will be an outhouse that we never see, but they have to have one. So there's gonna be an outhouse back there that everybody uses. But also, they're going to have a seasonal garden, and a sizable one, because this is actually going to be what they had and how they fed everyone, and that's going to be a whole conversation on its own, like this is a food and drink kind of scenario. But just to touch on it a little bit, is they had seasonal food and spices, and they ate really well, and it wasn't just like, here's your meat on meat on meat. No, they had lots of produce. You could see the food that they're eating. And then there was a whole 2 restaurant chains in real life based off of the food that they ate. So we see they have all kinds of produce at all different times of year. And also there is always usually always a large bowl of very nice looking apples on the dining room table, and the kitchen table, or what am I trying to say? The coffee table. Yeah, I'm going to get to that. Somebody's asking about what became of that room. I'm getting to that. So initially we see it as Hop Sing's quarters. We know that he doesn't stay there forever. Then for a while we see it as a guest room. And then presumably it became Will's room for a while, but we don't really see Will's room at any point, or him in a bedroom that we say, oh, this is Will's room, or see him coming in and out of it. I don't believe. Will was kind of just a flash in the pan situation as that goes. So we didn't have to focus very much on what happened with him. But ultimately it became Candy's room. And Candy obviously came on as to be the worker, which he was reluctant to do at first in his story. But then he quickly was promoted to foreman because he had all these really good skills. And he then they have he kind of becomes one of the family. So a really integral part of, he's a pseudo Cartwright, right? And I think that Candy is pretty much like, next to Hosser Ben, like the best character of the show. Like, I really love Candy. There's nothing bad to say about Candy. He was so excellent. He was so virtuous and very modern, in accordance to these old traditional things. He was sort of like almost a time traveler type character. He's got a very indiscriminate background. We know a little bit about him. We don't even know his full name, and nobody seems to care. And he's got a kind of a time traveler essence about it. But Candy will definitely get his own episode, so fear not about that. But that also goes to say that he was allowed his own house with his own entry, but he didn't sleep upstairs with the family, right? Each one of them had their own room, so that's 4 rooms. The upper floor layout is very confusing when you're talking logistically, like how it literally laid out, because it seems like there's really not enough room for what's supposed to be going on. Because time somebody came through, like, oh, okay, go upstairs, go upstairs. And it wasn't implied that they were always, sometimes, but not always, giving up their own rooms, right? So we know that there were 4 bedrooms at least, and we don't exactly know the layout either. The implication was that Adams was the first door as soon as you went up the stairs. And then that somehow Haas's room always had the front facing window, but that was an open floor plan, like there was no floor there. So when you see the exterior of the house and there's a window there, it's confusing unless you think of it like somehow it's over the staircase, like you double back somehow, which doesn't make a lot of sense. So that logistically doesn't make sense. So you kind of just have to go with it however you want to go with it. So we have at least 4 main bedrooms, but then for the number of people that they can house at any given time, that would imply that there are at least 1 to 2 extra bedrooms before Adam leaves, because that obviously would leave a yes. And female guests were always, someone has said, female guests were always given an upstairs bedroom. I'm guessing for safety and privacy purposes. And then ultimately Jamie gets an upstairs bedroom. So we have to kind of think of, like, before Adam left, before the 4 dedicated bedrooms that were being used, then there have to be at least 1 to 2 other bedrooms. And sometimes they have large amounts of people staying with them. And I understand multiple people staying in, like, the same room, but if they weren't really, if they're entertaining a lot of people, that implies that there's more people than there are rooms. So you have to imagine that that means at least there's 2 extra rooms. Kind of weird, because you can't really, that doesn't really logistically play out with how things work. So you can kind of arrange those mentally however you want, but they didn't actually exist. Where did Griff sleep? Bunkhouse. Griff was not really part of the family. They didn't even really get that far with him. Griff was in the bunkhouse. So there were other people there, and they would put people up in the bunkhouse, and sometimes the barn too. I guess if they were stinky, they go to the barn. So no, Griff I think was meant to be more integrated of a character. They just didn't get that far, and I was a Griff fan. I always had like, as long as I've been alive, I've had a crush on Tim Matheson. So I would have liked to really seen that story get developed more. It was a neat story. When we first are introduced to him, Candy goes and picks him up at prison, and they're going to give him a chance. And that's how that goes. But he was only there for the last year. It didn't really work out because of the show getting canceled and everything kind of falling apart. And so Griff didn't make it. He didn't get a very good shot. But he was very instantly connected to everyone, and connected to Candy, and connected to the Cartwrights, and became very devoted to them. We just didn't really get to see it all play out very far. That's funny to think about Griff. I actually forgot to include him into this conversation in these notes, because I'm gonna go a little further with this. So anyways, the good years, basically, you could, so again, the only physical part of the set that existed was the bottom floor. The kitchen didn't. That was another set piece. Any interior bedroom was another set piece. The monkhouse was in those things were in other parts of studios. All the bedrooms, that. So they also, same with the barn. And also, it bears saying that they had a water tap. They had running water. They have a pump outside at the horse trough, and they have one in the kitchen. And that would have been pretty much reserved for very wealthy, capable people who could, run pipe. And again, we're supposed to attribute that to Adam and his engineering and architectural know-how and skill and prodigy ability, that kind of a thing. So they have running water, which is an attribution to him. But when you look at the story on the whole, just like the entire show, inside the story as well, we know that there were several things that went pretty wrong, that you wouldn't necessarily hope happened, but I guess, you can historically look at it and be like, all right. And I think the first of those things was when Adam left. We know the reasons why Purnell left. He felt unstimulated, under-challenged by the role. And he didn't mesh with the other guys. They had it was sort of them and him kind of a situation. They really didn't have the same love between the 3 of them that Dan, Lauren, and Michael had. It really didn't extend to him, and it was kind of the way he had it. I mean, I don't think that they were. If you take Michael Landon's version of things into account, he said they pretty much never exchanged a word outside of filming lines. So he was not in the fold the way that they were. And it didn't mean what it meant to them. To them, it was an institution. To them, it was more than a job. It was their life. They felt like they were doing something important. They went out on tours of studios, or I'm sorry, of arenas, and they were like rock star style. They went and did rodeo things. They learned how to ride their horses. They learned how to, well, you could assume Dan knew how to ride a horse, but the others, not so much. And they went on tours. They were grand marshals in the Indianapolis 500 at different times. They made appearances everywhere in the off season. They, grand marshaled all kinds of parades. They were major celebrities as those characters, and those characters were beloved, and they protected those characters, and they loved those characters. And although they weren't really like their characters that much, Lauren probably the most like Ben, the others not so much. They wanted to be seen that way. They appreciated it, and they saw what they had, and they knew it was special because it had never existed before. If you basically take like this, maybe something we would apply these days to something, but it was the first time any of that had happened, and it was the first time prestige television had happened. That was all new. It was all brand new stuff. So they took it very seriously. Lauren even made a replica of, built a house that was as much of a replica that still exists today that you can go and see. I think it's in Arizona. That was supposed to replicate the Ponderosa, and his wife searched for all kinds of antiques that were as close as she could find to what was in the show. So it meant a lot to them. It really meant a lot to them, and they really wanted it, and they believed what they were doing as well, because there was a lot of stories about them refusing to play for segregated audiences. They had a lot of practice what you preach, sort of. I mean, and again, what we hear about, we know that they were real live people, and this is the thing that I talk about in my Buster book as well. They're like, they can't be perfect all the time. They're not deities. They're not real. They're not who they are on screen. And they are real people with real struggles and real issues. And I think that a lot of people, kind of depending on your point of view and depending on, hindsight being 2020, people don't really think of Michael Landon in very favorable ways nowadays, or what we would say that what we would consider, kind of falls into the cringe type, like not great type of a situation. But the others, I think that they thought of themselves as wanting to be seen in this sort of virtuous upholding kind of way, and practice what they preached, where Michael Landon really wanted to make sure the show and then his later projects practiced that virtuousness, even if he didn't necessarily do that. So ultimately, we kind of got to fast forward through the show, what we know, what we've seen, and we get to the next big problem. Adam leaves. Right? That's the first big problem. And they ultimately compensate with Candy, and I think Candy was such a much better character than Adam. I know that there's going to be a lot of pushback on that, because I know that for some reason, and I really can't explain it, Adam has more fans than anybody. If you look into the fandoms, he's wildly popular. To me, I don't have a lot of good things to say, and I'm not afraid to say them. It's like, oh no, don't, I don't care. I'll say what I want to say, and I will get into the whys and the hows when I get into his episode. But that was the first big problem with the show, because as Purnell leaves, we also have to explain why Adam leaves, and there's really no explanation why Adam leaves. And they talk about him very sparingly. Every now and again, they'll mention they got a letter from him for a couple of years. Yes, everyone loved Candy. I think that's probably correct. He was like a breath of fresh air for the show. And when they were kind of pigeonholed with the three of them, because we also got into the place where Haas and Joe were always, like best friends for life, like everything, super close, like the ultimate relationship of brothers could be. But then Haas was also getting older, and these sort of silly storylines and these silly adventures the two of them would go on, it didn't really hold anymore. And I think Dan sensed that and wanted to go into a more adult realm, and I think he would have anyways take on more adult responsibility, Haas that being. So bringing in Candy kind of even things out, even the playing field. It kind of gave Joe a little bit, somebody to run around with a little bit, and it kind of gave Haas somebody to run around with a little bit. He really filled in the gaps. He really did. But that was a very good solution, except then again, later down the road, due to actual real life consequences, there were he left for a season because there were contract disputes, right? David Canary left for a season. But then we have the biggest problem of all. So we know that in the show, it was never really exactly addressed where Adam went. He just that he never came back, and they stopped talking about him ultimately altogether. And the fan canon was that he went and settled in Australia, and that became such a popular notion. It is almost actual canon at this point. So a lot of people really, really agreed with that idea that he went somewhere very far away. And there's really nothing to say after a point that he maintained contact. I know that's sad for people to think of, but he went on his way, and he just eventually, I mean, and that happens, I guess, but they stopped talking about him. He stops being a presence in the show of any kind. It had gone so long, they had new generations of fans, right? So who even was Adam in a time when reruns had just started to happen? Who even was, right? So they end up in a situation where he basically is just lost to them, and stops really kind of, there's no real, you have to assume there's no more contact because they don't say anything about him anymore after a certain point. There's nothing more to be said. So if he's not writing, if they don't know where he is, that's what happens. And he never comes back. We know that the show ends before that. So you can, if you want to think that he comes back, you can. I personally don't. Because if you leave in the first place and you never come back for all that time, not even to visit or whatever that we see, then I can't assume that he would ever come back for any reason. And I'm not opposed to the Australia theory. That works for me. It's fine. It'd be pretty hard to come back from that anyways, so, for visit. So they lose him, essentially. And that's the first major problem. Then the next major problem is that Candy leaves for a year. And the majorest problem of them all was that, inexplicably, Dan dies. And he was very young, 43 years old. And this took, like, the bite right out of the show. It broke the back of the show, essentially. And it broke production's back. It destroyed the people who were around him. He was so loved. And then the world, he was the most beloved character, period. There was nobody who was more beloved than Haas. For children and for the people who've grown up on the show, for all the fans, the adult fans of the show, nobody loved anybody more than Haas on anything at all, period. Like, number one best thing. So it was a massive devastation, and they felt like they owed it his memory to not just immediately cut the show off and end it, which, hindsight being what it is, might have been the way to go. But they tried. They really tried. But within the series, it really, the backbone of the show had been broken. It was irretrievable at that point. And to show you what a good dude he was, and how tight they all were in real life, David Canary put his objections aside and returned to the show to finish it out. So he was gone for a year, and he returned because it was such a devastating blow to all of them that had happened. So ultimately, what we come up with now is we know that it didn't last very much longer after he died, and everything just kind of was circling the drain at that point. They were bringing in characters who nobody really cared about. They had Jamie, who was meant for the younger kids, but he really was never a very good fit. Nothing necessarily against Mitch Vogel. He was very accomplished in a lot of the other work he was doing. He didn't do a bad job, anything like that. But it's sort of the same thing with Griff. And these characters, it just sort of felt like it was, we were just circling the drain at that point with the show. Because there's nothing left to say. There's nothing left to do. The storylines became kind of silly in a lot of the cases. And I think that, or immaterial. And I think that also was because they were so disturbed by Dan's passing that they just didn't really have it, or didn't really have they didn't really have the love for it anymore. It just sort of, for all of them, was not the same anymore, and it was just a very sad reminder of who they were missing and what they were missing in their real lives and the work lives and what the legacy of Bonanza meant. So they tried, it didn't work out. But then also we have to jump back into the idea that the show was canceled. It didn't get to finish its run. It was ended. And so people have again gone on to theorize, which you don't have to do, obviously, but have gone on to theorize that they tried to kind of figure out an ending to all of this stuff. So we know that after Haas dies, and that's attributed to him drowning trying to save someone, a woman, that at some point Joe leaves we also assume that Adam never returns and that Joe leaves to fight in some level of the Spanish American War, which doesn't really time out historically, but that was supposed to be somewhere a little bit of canon, a little bit of fan canon mixed together in there, and forgetting about like historical timelines, and then was ultimately killed in some sort of battle. And that kind of really does make sense for his character. I feel like he was in a place and an age, because we know he also lost a wife and a baby that were murdered in that span of time. So things really unraveled for Joe. And after the series ends, if you want to try to create like, okay, well then what happened to everything, right? That's what people tend to believe, that he went to fight in some part of the Spanish American War, Revolution, or war rather, and was ultimately killed there. And I think a lot of people would assume Candy would have gone with him, but that's kind of a misconception. And that they really weren't. Was this after? Yes, I'm talking about after the show ended. I was just asked, was this after the death of his wife and baby? Yes. That was, so he not only had Haas died, he then had a wife and a baby die, and he had to go through this whole vigilante situation to track down the people that did it. So he was really, really messed up, at that point. And then there was when they're filming that scene, like, Michael and Lauren together, they're actually like weeping, like in real life. Like when you see that scene, it's like very devastating about the wife and the baby thing. And that was actually just holdover feelings for having lost Dan. They were not really acting in that scene. So, and that's something again you don't really get without it being a very serious, thing. And I mean, you do when like shows end, like you'll see like where they're like having like real tears and stuff like that, because they're like, you can tell they're filming their last scenes or something like that. But that was like real to them, it was a really real loss. So if you go beyond the cancellation of the show and you think, okay, well, what happened to all these characters? That's what's supposed to have happened to Joe. And then a lot of people probably assume Candy went with him because offhand it looks like they're best friends, but they're really not best friends, honestly. They're really not. They're not ride or dies. They're adversarial. Like, they are good friends. They care about each other, but they're also very adversarial at a lot of times. And there are a lot of moments when they would probably get into a lot more fist fights because Joe is really hot-headed all the time and Candy's really cool about everything. So he just kind of lets things be. But Joe will be rude and snap at him and say stupid shit. Like there's the episode, a boy named or a girl named George, I think it's called. It's about the photography, about trick photography and double exposures, and Candy they're all real mad about this. So, and Candy comes in and he just wants to see the picture, and Joe's like, meh. Like, what do you know about it? Get the hell out of here, you dick. We don't even care about you, right? You're not one of us. It kind of gives him one of those, and Candy's just cool about it. And he's like, I just wanted to see the photo. And he explains how he knows what a double exposure is and explains that the shadows are in the wrong place and that it's a double exposure. And it's sort of this moment of, well, if you weren't being such a dick, I'd explain it to you. He's just very patient about it. So he was much more devoted, I think, to Ben and Haas ultimately than he really was to Joe. Like, they got to pal around together and stuff, but it was really more of a, like, I think he had felt more for Ben than he did. And especially at that point, like, what we do know about him is he's ex-military. He was an ex-army brat. He's really anti-army. If he's essentially like anti-war activist, basically, of the time, which we're talking early and middle 70s, that did fall along in line with what was actually going on with Vietnam, right? So his character being an anti-army, anti-war situation, albeit kind of like not like banging the drum, but that it's part of his character, there's really no way that I can see that he would have agreed to go fight in any kind of conflict for any reason whatsoever. So if you subscribe to the fact that Joe went to basically be killed, it was sort of suicide by war, and get involved in something that had nothing to do with him or their land or anything about it, just because he basically spiraled out of control and he was just kind of couldn't live anymore. So basically, what's that leave? Ben. So again, we see more tragedy in Ben's life at this point. So he's lost his contact with his first son, doesn't know if he's alive or dead. His second son has died. His third son has gone to commit suicide by war. So he's left with his adopted son, and he's left with Candy. And I don't believe for a second that Candy would go with him. Maybe Griff would go, but I don't believe that Candy would go fight in any conflict whatsoever for any reason. So there's that, and I think that's really important. So what we ultimately, this is sort of me thinking it now. I haven't really heard about anybody else saying what they think about happened at this point, but essentially, now with all of them gone, all of the sons are gone out of the picture. We have Jamie, the adopted son, and we have Candy, to a lesser extent Griff. Griff is basically just a worker, though, because we assume maybe he stayed on and that kind of thing, but there's just not enough to know about him to know if he would. But we know that Candy was very, very dedicated to the Ponderosa, to Ben, and would not go fight in a war whatsoever. You can't convince me otherwise. So if you think about what's going to happen, then ultimately ownership would then transfer to one or both of them, being Candy and Jamie. Because there'd be no one else to leave it to. There were no heirs. And then there was a sequel series made that pretty much has been discounted. No one really counts that as canon. Where they really just wanted to fold the actual sons into the production of a new kind of Bonanza. However, they didn't even cast Dan's son as his son, but someone else in town. So it was just a complete mess around. It was totally wrong. But those things did imply that there was that Haas had a son before he had died that maybe he didn't know about. I can't remember the exact notion. I don't think he knew about it. And that ultimately Joe had also had a son. And I don't know if they meant that they were taking back that the baby that had died had lived, or this was another child or something. But both would have been I guess maybe not to their knowledge. And so there were just the idea to be able to have heirs, basically. But nobody really counts that as canonical, as a real thing. So that, although it did exist, and I guess you would technically say it's canon, no one really counts that. Because it was a way to try to revive it, and it's something that, and I will talk about the possibility of revival and how it could be done, but it was something that to this time has never been able to effectively be done. Although many series and many movies and movie of the week kind of stuff is tried, it's never ever come close anywhere near it. So ultimately, what we're thinking about then is that as Ben gets to the end of his life, which probably, I mean, it might have been a little bit of Legends of the Fall here, like things probably didn't go very well. He may have lasted a long time. He may have died right off, after all this tragedy. But we have to think he might have started selling off parcels of land, for development, or just deeded it all to them, or just to Jamie or to Candy or whatever. But it would have ultimately, just like most things, just disappeared from history. And that's where the future of it goes. So that's what I mean, like with the idea of futility. You can leave it in the golden years and stop it when it stops, or you can think forward about where it goes. And to me, that's where it goes. I think that there would be logically that it would I mean, if you want to count Candy out, it would, and say Ben didn't even have a will, which of course he would, then it would be next of kin, which would be Jamie. So then Jamie would have it all. And maybe he parceled off the land. Maybe he didn't run it well. Maybe it got taken. Maybe there were tax issues. Maybe, you can write any story that you want to, as far as that goes. But, I think that at least that you could mix kind of some actual canon with some fan canon there, and where the show stops, you can complete the story without having to go to great leaps and bounds. But that altogether, I think, is really the tale of the Ponderosa. It was, it was around, it had about close to about 40 good years, let's say. And before, and it really speaks more to the tragedy of Ben's life, that there was so much tragedy in his early life. He had, about 40 good years there, and then there was so much tragedy going forward after that, to the point that it just sort of fades away. And that's, I think, disappointing. Whatever ending you want to put on it, ultimately that's the futility of it, that it just fades away. It just stops, it ceases to be. But that's all I've got for you as far as that goes. And I've got a lot of other topics that will kind of divulge back into this and out of this, and it within, without, all of that. And I've talked here for quite a bit of time now, so I'd like to wrap it up. and it's easy for me to pontificate about Bonanza because there's just so much to say, and there's so much lore, and there's so much to think about. But that is something I think that I'll talk more about, how it supported itself, and how it affected the community of Nevada, and settlers and stuff, and what they had available to them, and how it all worked in a future episode. But I'm really glad to have been able to come back around and finally spend some time on it again. And it'll probably be a while before I get to it again, but this was the entire intent of all of this to begin with. So coming up, top of next month, first Thursday next month, I will have another episode of, which one? Meanwhile, back at the ranch, and we'll be getting a lot closer to the release date of the book, so I'll have hopefully some more info for you at that point about what's going on. And I'll pontificate about that for a while, and then going forward, we'll have another one of these, and right before the book comes out in November. I would normally have a Million Movie Project episode that would time out right like 2 days before. But I think what we'll end up doing is probably just talking mostly about the book and the release, and I'll be taking any questions, comments, whatever. And you're all always welcome to reach out to me on my socials. I'm on everything at this point. I'm on Blue Sky now. I said I wouldn't do it, but I got an invite. Somebody gave me an invite, so I took it, and I just kind of feel very overwhelmed and lonely there, so I don't know what I'm really doing yet. So if you're there, come and follow me, because it's kind of crickets over there at this time. And I'm everywhere else, too. I'm on TikTok and Twitter and Facebook, and I'm in a lot of the groups of movies and things like that. You can find out anything you want to know about my Buster book, and you can always reach out to me in that way. So I'm around, but that, I think, is going to bring this episode to a close. And thank you for joining me. I appreciate you coming by and contributing to the conversation. And I will see you at the top of next month. And we're all very excited about the book coming out and all the future things I'm working on, which I'll also discuss a little bit more. So remember, if you're looking for something safe and local to do, check out your local drive-in theaters. That's always something fun to do. And stop doing fireworks. I'm sick of the goddamn fireworks. No more fireworks. Fireworks is over, so no more fireworks. And just be safe and be good to each other, and look about forming unions in your workplace. Unionize your workplace. Talk to your coworkers about what you're earning. You can't be fired for talking about unions. It's illegal. So try to make unions everywhere you can, and let's have a broader conversation about forming people's unions outside of labor. Check out my previous episode about that topic, and I will see you guys again soon. So be safe. Goodbye.